Just to get started with some housekeeping. If you are a student in the SUNY Paltz psychology department, not taking the evolutionary studies class, and you want SONA credits, please look in the chat, and we have detailed instructions on that process for getting credit. And please follow them. I appreciate it. And secondly, if you are a guest from outside the college, we want to hear where you're from. I've heard from lots of people, including people from as far away as Australia, asking about this event. And I think it would be great to get a record of where people are coming from. So if you're from outside the college community and you want to just go quickly in the chat and just sign in with your name and location, I think that would be terrific. We'd very much appreciate that, simply for the record. And at the end of the talk, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. There's a way through the software that you can raise your hand virtually, and so please do it that way. I will unmute you, and you'll be able to ask questions at that particular point, and we look forward to that. And I'll also say, this was totally not by chance, but today happens to be International Women's Day, so what could be better than a talk titled "When Men Behave Badly"? Thought that was kind of ironic, but you'll see that I think this is actually a talk that's going to be highly appropriate and highly educational. So I'm thrilled to be introducing Dr. David Buss from the University of Texas here tonight. David has taught at Berkeley, Harvard, Michigan, and Texas. He's listed on just about every list you'll see of the most influential living behavioral scientists. And I'll tell you that in my own experience, when I was a graduate student at the University of New Hampshire in 1994, I went to this talk by this guy named David Buss, who I'd heard of, and I heard this book called Evolution of Desire that he'd just written, and I was excited about it. And when I heard his talk, which was about human mating and intimate relationships from an evolutionary perspective, it changed the way that I think about the human experience permanently, and I think in a very profound kind of way. And so I have David to thank so much for really influencing my ability to understand evolution and see its applicability. And I know that there are a lot of people around the world who read his work who I think would agree. So, you know, I could tell you about the great books he's written. I could tell you about the great alumni he's got all over the world. David is just an outstanding scholar and teacher in so many respects. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Buss.
Well, thank you, Glenn, and thank you for inviting me to this wonderful event. And it's a terrific service that you're doing to the whole community. I had no idea about that lecture that you. I don't think you ever mentioned that to me before, but that I permanently ruined your life. So let's see. So I want to get the PowerPoint up. I hit the share.
Yeah.
And then hit the PowerPoint. Share. The PowerPoint is not up. Sorry about this.
There you go.
Here we go. Okay, is everything?
It looks great. It looks great.
Okay, so this is actually the first talk that I've given that's based on my new book, which is not even out yet. When Men Behave Badly, Hidden Roots of Sexual Deception, Harassment, and Assault, and it's going to be out next month. It took me, I would say, on and off 30 years of research that went into this book, both by me and also by colleagues of mine from around the world, collaborators, students, former students, and so forth. 30 years of research and about 3 years to write. And it's a pretty, it goes into depth on a variety of topics, basically the ways in which men and women torture each other, which is how I got into this area to begin with. And the first study actually I did was 1989 on it. And so this is, I guess, a progress report of sorts. but I've become increasingly impressed with how important this topic is. Among other things, it makes the news in your neck of the wood, Glenn, pretty much every day at the moment, but in everybody's neck of the woods. I want to say a few words. Oh, what is that? Excuse me. I started at the very end. Let me, this is my incompetence here. So forgive this. Now I just been back at the beginning here. So I want to just give a warning. I'm not a big fan of trigger warnings at all, but this topic I think warrants it. And I teach a class to hundreds and hundreds of undergraduates in human sexuality. And so I give them basically the same warning. I mean, the sexuality, the fact is it's a very personal topic for people. And some people have had very bad experiences with it. So the last book that I co-wrote with Cindy Meston 12 years ago called Why Women Have Sex, that was one of the things that struck me the most, is how many people have had bad experiences with their sex life. And I found it very disturbing, and I still find it disturbing. So, so the material that I'm going to talk about today is disturbing, or may be disturbing to some people, but my hope in writing this book is that it will help victims of sexual conflict, which are many, and also to prevent future sexual violence. So that's warning. Sorry? Okay. So I want to say a few words about why I titled the book, Why Men Behave Badly. I'm sorry, When Men Behave Badly. The book is anchored in what's called sexual conflict theory, which I'll get into in a bit more depth momentarily. So basically, males and females have been engaged in a co-evolutionary arms race, or what's called technically sexually antagonistic co-evolution, for over 1 billion years. And so these forms of sexual conflict range all over the place, from deception to harassment to assault to all kinds of horrible ways in which men and women torture each other. And so although the book is anchored in sexual conflict theory, and both men and women do bad things to each other, the more horrific the bad thing is, the more men tend to do it. So when you get into things like sexual harassment, sexual assault, the more violent forms of stalking, that is criminal stalking, more and more men tend to have not an exclusive monopoly on it, but tend to be wildly overrepresented in it. And hence that's the focus on men. So even though I talk about some bad things that women do, including sexual treachery, deception, mate poaching, and so forth in the book, there's more of an emphasis on the bad things that men do. Now, the word when men behave badly is a qualifier to indicate two things. Okay, one is that a lot of people are mixed bags, and so you can have in the same person acts of altruism, acts of cooperation, acts of generosity, etc., alongside with sometimes acts of bad behavior. The bad behavior, though, is at least to some degree predictable bad behavior. That is, we know something about the social circumstances, the relationship circumstances, the cultural circumstances that predict when men behave badly, and so that's why I titled it that way. And I had some ambivalence about the word badly because because I needed a word that covered the whole gamut of things, from white lies to sexual assault, and there isn't one term to describe the whole range of things. And so I kind of settled on this. But the subtitle, I think, accurately captures the book, The Hidden Roots of Sexual Deception, Harassment, and Assault. And they're hidden in two senses. One is that people who commit these acts are not aware, or are certainly not fully aware or conscious of the underlying psychological mechanisms that are driving the bad behavior. And second, they're not aware of the evolutionary roots of those psychological mechanisms that cause bad behavior. And so that's why they remain hidden from view. And one of the goals of my book is to make them unhidden, to make people more aware of what the underlying psychology and the causal origins of that psychology are. Okay, why isn't it progressing here? Sorry about that. Okay, now this kind of gives you a little bit of illustration. I tried to do an internet search on serial sexual harassers or serial sexual predators, and I couldn't find any. So, you know, why is it the case that when you get to these extreme things, there is a wild predominance of men and not women who are doing these bad things? What I want to argue, and I hope to show you in this talk, is that sexual violence against women is the most widespread human rights problem in the world. Yes, there are many human rights problems in the world, but I think this is the most widespread in the sense of having a negative impact on the largest number of people. So, for example, if you look at the types of sexual violence that occur, there is a staggering range of types. So some can seem relatively mild or innocuous: unwanted sexual attention, catcalls, leering, bird whistles, etc. Unwanted sexual attention, leering, non-consensual touching, groping, or kissing, sexual harassment, of course, and that is in the news. The governor of New York has been prominent. I guess more women are coming out about that. Sexual harassment has been a persistent problem, of course, but there was a flurry of attention to it in the 1990s with Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas, but then it kind of faded from view, and then only relatively recently, in the last few years, has come to more pronounced attention. Sexual deception. I keep getting these requests for approval. Sexual deception is something that occurs. Men and women both do that. I go into some depth on that in the book. Intimate partner violence is something that Dr. Josh Duntley and I have studied, and mate guarding. And it is true that both men and women engage in intimate partner violence, or IPV. It used to be called domestic violence. I never liked the term domestic violence because it seems so tranquil. Oh, it's domestic. But intimate partner violence is what it's called these days. And some have argued that men and women are equal in committing acts of sexual intimate partner violence. But the more extreme the violent act, the more men tend to be overrepresented. So there are centers for battered women in every major city in the United States. To my knowledge, there is only one center for battered men. Now, there could be different reasons for that, such as men could feel more embarrassed or ashamed about reporting violence. It could be that the police are less receptive to violence, domestic violence, when it's reported by a man than by a woman. And there are cases like that. I recount in the book one case of a guy who got clocked in the head with a frying pan by his wife, and he was bleeding profusely, called the police. The police came, and he explained what had happened, and the police basically discouraged the man from reporting it. He said, if your wife has so much as broken a fingernail, then you will be arrested, not her. And so there has been perhaps some sexual inequality on the side of police that perhaps is deserving of attention. But it is the case that empirically, the more extreme the violence, the more damaging the violence, the more men tend to have a monopoly on it. Stalking, when it comes to criminal stalking, about 80% of the stalkers are men, about 20% are victims, are women. And again, the more violent forms of stalking tend to be perpetrated by men. And I devote a whole chapter in the book to stalking. And in fact, Josh Duntley, who I mentioned earlier, he and I have created a website called stalkinghelp.org to help victims of stalking. That gives them access to links, some help literature, legal issues, and so forth. And so that's an important issue. Stalking laws didn't come into existence in the United States until 1992, so they're relatively recent, less than 30 years. And then even when it comes to cyber stalking, which has become increasingly common, the laws still haven't caught up. And so it's only 1 or 2 states that have criminalized cyber stalking. Revenge porn is another one. To my knowledge, there is only one study that I'm aware of that has done a wide-scale survey of victims of revenge porn. So these are typically cases where there's a mateship and there's a breakup, and the man typically posts you do it on these revenge porn websites, posts naked pictures of selfies or texts of their former partner in ways that can be devastating to the victim. And one study coming out of Australia found that 10% of women have experienced revenge porn. In one case that we know about, it resulted in the suicide of the woman. Stranger rape, acquaintance rape, spousal rape, these are all extremely important problems. In the case of, as probably most of you already know, spousal rape was not even considered rape until relatively recently, and in many countries it is still not considered rape. Honor killings, sex trafficking. The point of this list is simply to highlight the fact that there is a staggering and really appalling range of different forms of sexual violence against women. And when we look at the, why isn't this forwarding here? When we look at percentages, of course, the percentages who have been victimized by these things vary all over the place. It's going to depend on the definition, the method of sampling, and so forth. So these are crude approximations and shouldn't be taken as, precise estimates. But overall, 59% of women report having been sexually harassed at some point. In Canada, which has unusually low rates of intimate partner violence, the best estimates are that 27% of women will experience sexual intimate partner violence at some point during their lifespan. Stalking victims, one study done of many thousands of high school students found that 19% of women, high school women, had experienced stalking. Estimates of rape are probably the most variable, again, depending on how it's defined, the method that's used, etc. But rough estimates are that 17 to 23% of women will experience or have experienced rape or attempted rape at some point in their life to this point. And as I mentioned, 10%, that 10% figure on revenge porn coming out of Australia, we don't know what the percentages are in other countries. That's one of the first studies of its kind. This recently came out. The key point here that I'm making is simply that that these percentages are pretty alarmingly high. These forms of sexual violence are not infrequent. They're not rare. They're not, in the background, so to speak. They're very prominent, pervasive, and problematic. And we combine that with dramatic underreporting. As I'm sure everybody who's listening to this knows, that things like sexual assault and intimate partner violence are tremendously underreported. And these are just some estimates. So, say 3/4 are never reported. And there are many causes of that. Some have to do with the impact, the psychological impact on the victims, the shame that they experience, their belief that they won't be believed, the intense questioning of whether they were part of whether they might have caused the assault to begin with, and so forth. And frankly, the low likelihood of the perpetrator actually getting justice, being charged with a crime, being successfully prosecuted, and actually serving time in jail. The rates are appallingly low for these crimes. Now, I'm sure I don't have to tell most of you the range of harms of sexual violence to women, but these are some of the ones that have been very well documented, and I go over these in some detail in the book. Damage to the woman's self-esteem, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic stress syndrome, disorder is sometimes called. I have a section in the book where I raise the question of whether PTSD or PTSD-like symptoms reflect an adaptation or, in fact, are a true disorder. And that's an interesting set of issues to look at. It impairs school and work performance. It impairs their social life. Some experience suicidal ideation, and some actually commit suicide or attempt to commit suicide as a consequence. So it's extremely harmful. We're not talking about something that is mild in its aftermath. And in addition to the primary victims, there are also secondary victims, and these are rarely considered. The female friends of the victim, the work colleagues, the male friends of the victim, the romantic partners. For example, we know that after a woman has been sexually assaulted by someone not in the romantic relationship, there's a very high probability of dissolution of that relationship. It tends to wreak havoc in relationships when a sexual assault occurs. Family members, the distress caused to family members, and then also the distress caused to women who are not victims but live in fear of sexual violence occurring to them or their friends when sexual violence occurs. And so there's some evidence of a contagion effect. So there are studies, for example, of women in the military where sexual assault is a very important problem. And when a woman finds out that a friend or a cousin has been sexually assaulted during basic training, that leads to this contagion effect where all the other women become fearful of that. And so there are all these secondary victims of sexual assault that are rarely considered in addition to the primary victims. And so that's part of why I say that this is a human rights violation that is extremely widespread and perhaps the most widespread in the world. Okay, so now from an evolutionary perspective, why might it be so widespread and why might it cause so much harm? Well, a key reason is because it violates sexual choice. That is, the freedom to choose when, where, with whom, and in which circumstances one engages in sexual activity. And I think this should be a fundamental human right. If you look at the international human rights, this isn't in there. You could perhaps subsume it under one of the more abstract categories of things, but I think it should be a fundamental human right. And one of the things that sexual assault does is it bypasses that human right. It violates sexual choice. And that brings us to, of course, Charles Darwin and the theory of sexual selection. And I'm sure many in the audience are familiar with this, and so I'll just, forgive me for mentioning it, but some I know are not familiar with it, and so I just want to mention it very briefly. Darwin, who is known for his theory of natural selection in 1859, became very puzzled by things that could not be explained by the so-called survival selection. Things like the brilliant plumage of peacocks, also sexual dimorphism, differences in the size, shape, morphology of males and females of the same species. And he was puzzled by these things because they didn't seem to have anything to do with survival or survival advantage. He even said in one of his private correspondences, "The sight of a peacock gives me nightmares." He could not explain it on the theory of survival selection or natural selection. And Consequently, in 1871, he published his theory of sexual selection, which deals not with the evolution of characteristics due to their survival advantage, but rather the evolution of characteristics due to their mating advantage. And mating advantage accrues through two causal processes: preferential mate choice and same-sex competition. Same-sex competition is that stereotype of two stags locking horns in combat, with the victor gaining sexual access to the female. And the logic is that whatever qualities lead to success in these same-sex battles, those qualities get passed on in greater numbers because of the greater sexual access that the victors accrue. Qualities associated with losing same-sex competitions basically bite the evolutionary dust. They fail to get passed on. And so you see evolution, that is change over time, simply be by virtue of the outcomes of this contest competition. So that's one causal process. The second, and the one that's the focus here, is preferential mate choice. And Darwin observed, and it was partly an empirical observation, that females of many species tended to be more selective, more discerning, more discriminating about who they mated with. And the logic of this was that if there was some consensus about the qualities that females desired in potential mates, then those who possessed the desirable qualities would have a mating advantage, and they would get preferentially chosen as mates and hence enjoy a reproductive advantage. Qualities associated that were not preferred would, again, bite the evolutionary dust. And so as you see evolution or change over time, an increase in frequency of qualities that are desired. Now, this is all old hat. This is Darwin, 1871, and biologists at the time were extremely dismissive of this preferential mate choice component. They went along with, they said that we can understand the logic of same-sex competition. Contest competition was another word for it, phrase for it, but they thought that females influencing the evolution of characteristics of the species was too preposterous and far-fetched to go for. And so there was a brief flurry of interest in 1930 by the statistician R.A. Fisher, but it wasn't really until about 100 years later, 101 years later to be precise, 1972, that Robert Trivers resurrected or brought back to life the theory of sexual selection by introducing parental investment, which influences which sex does the competing and which sex does the choosing. And Trivers argued that the sex that does the higher investing tends to be more choosy, more discriminating. The sex that invests less in offspring tends to be more competitive with members of their own for access to members of the opposite high investing sex. And now, of course, sexual selection theory has become one of the dominant theories in evolutionary biology and is tremendously important and is critical to understanding the mating systems of basically all sexually reproducing species. So it went from being a laughed at theory or ignored or derided in Darwin's time to being one of the most important theories in evolutionary biology to this in the modern times. So now, understanding the causes, consequences, and underlying psychology of perpetrators and victims can help us create cures. And I don't think anyone would doubt that. If we can understand the causes of things, what's driving the bad behavior, then that can help guide us toward coming up with cures. And I'm going to argue that an evolutionary perspective can help us with this. It's not the only perspective that can help us with it, but I think given the pervasiveness of these sexual violence problems, we need all the tools we can get, and I think an evolutionary perspective is one of those tools. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, sexual conflict didn't start with humans. It started basically 1.2 to 2 billion years ago, estimates vary, with the evolution of sexual reproduction itself. Prior to this time, and in many species, in some species to this day, reproduction is asexual, where they're basically just mothers who give birth to daughters, and they're, it's a much easier in some ways system of reproduction than sexual reproduction, because sexual reproduction introduces things like sexual dimorphism. It introduces the adaptive problems of mate search, of finding a partner, of being reciprocally chosen by the partner that you are choosing, and so forth. But it's very, very ancient, and forms of sexual conflict exist in basically all sexually reproducing species. So I'll mention just one, far removed from humans. Sexual conflict wrapped in silk. So male spiders in this particular species give female spiders gifts that are basically prey, typically a dead insect, wrapped in silk, and that increases their mating success. That is, wrapping the gift in silk prevents the female from stealing it without copulating, which females sometimes try to do. And sometimes it conceals that the gift is just random trash. That is, males who fail to get a tasty morsel that females might find desirable will sometimes try to wrap it up and basically give her trash. Now, females have evolved to detect that, so they use scent in part to detect whether this is a true tasty morsel or just simply a piece of trash. And there's co-evolutionary processes, sexually antagonistic co-evolution between males and females that have resulted in adaptations and counter-adaptations and so forth in this species. And in many ways, okay, so a couple of insights that I'll just mention here. And this is sort of more big picture stuff. So sexual conflict must be framed in the context of many cross-sex cooperative relationships. That is, we are a supremely cooperative species. We form friendships, we form long-term mateships, we form cooperative relationships that are durable over years and sometimes decades, sometimes a lifespan. And so any type of sexual conflict has to be framed in the context of this fact that we are a supremely cooperative species. Sexual selection theory tells us that men are primarily in competition with other men and women are primarily in competition with other women for access to desirable mates. So it is not the case, and there are some theories that have argued that men as a group are united in their interest in oppressing women as a group, and from an evolutionary perspective, that cannot occur. And that it can't occur for this reason is one of the main ones, and there are others. That is, each male has specific alliances and cooperative relationships with some women, a mother, an aunt, a daughter, a female partner, a female friend. Each individual woman has alliances and a confluence of interest with some individual men. Okay, a father, a brother, an uncle, a son, a male mate, male friend. And so what we have to think about here when we think about sexual conflict is not men as a group against women as a group, but rather individual men and individual women in conflict with each other in specific delimited domains. Okay, I think I've just already said that, and I've said that. Okay, so one analog that is between predators and prey, and when I first started to use this analog, I thought, well, there are ways that all analogs break down at some point, and this one also breaks down, but in some ways it's actually on target. So we know, for example, that there's antagonistic co-evolution between predators and prey. So with cheetahs and impalas or gazelles, that for each increment in the speed and agility of a cheetah, then that selects for increments in speed and agility of the prey, the impala or gazelle. That is, those that are slower and less fleet of foot, if they're prey, they basically get eaten for dinner. Those that are a little faster, a little more fleet of foot, survive to live another day. From the cheetah's perspective, those that are who are a little slower and less fleet of foot die of starvation. And so I think that you take this antagonistic coevolution between species, and it applies with equal force within species in the form of sexually antagonistic coevolution. So, for example, hypothetical example, male sexual persistence. Let's say that an adaptation evolves for males to be sexually persistent because it results in higher levels of mating access. Well, if it interferes with female choice or causes harm to the female in some way, that causes a decline in the fitness, the reproductive fitness of the female who is a victim. And so that creates adaptations, selection for adaptations in females that are counter adaptations to prevent becoming a victim or to minimize the costs of being victimized after they occur, which results in a decline in the fitness of the males who are pursuing that sexually persistent strategy and so forth. And so you get these co-evolutionary arms races between males and females that are perpetual in the sense that they can continue just like predators and prey unless natural limits or other forces intervene. Excuse me, I'm getting a tad bit hoarse here. Hopefully that just goes away. Now, I'm going to talk about sex differences, and sex differences have become very controversial in the modern environment for reasons, some good reasons, some not so good reasons. But so I want to just very briefly present the meta theory of sex differences and similarities. From an evolutionary perspective, the meta theory is that we expect to see sex differences only in domains where the sexes have faced recurrently different problems, adaptive problems, over human evolutionary history. In all domains where the sexes have faced similar adaptive problems, we expect males and females to be, by and large, similar. And males and females are, by and large, similar psychologically in many respects, but they happen to differ where they face different adaptive problems. And those happen to fall heavily within the domain of mating. And the reason I wanted to present this meta theory to start with is because there are what I think is, some people call them sex difference deniers. And I think that often these sex difference deniers are well-intentioned. That is, some people are worried that if sex differences are discovered, then somehow it will result in discrimination against women. And so there's a well-intentioned, worthy concern. But I think actually ignoring sex differences that do exist is more harmful to women for reasons that I think you will become apparent as I go through this talk. Now, sex differences, we know that sex differences, that men and women differ in their reproductive biology in fundamental ways. That is, fertilization occurs internally within women, not within men. That creates the adaptive problem of paternity uncertainty. That is, men can never be sure that they are the genetic parent. Mothers are always sure. No woman has ever given birth, as far as I know, and as the child is emerging from her womb, wonders, gee, is this kid really my own? No, women are always 100%. Men can never be sure. As a result of this internal female fertilization, this can result in misdirected parental investment. We know that women have what's called obligatory parental investment, which is that 9-month period of pregnancy. And it's obligatory in the sense that it's non-negotiable. A woman can't say, I'm very busy with my career. I prefer to have only 3 months of investment. I prefer my male partner to invest the remaining time. No, it's just part of our reproductive biology. Functional mammary glands, body fat distribution, we know differs dramatically between men and women post-puberty. Ovulation in our species is concealed or relatively concealed. There's currently a lot of debate about how concealed or are there subtle cues to ovulation, but it is relatively concealed compared to, say, our closest primate cousin, the chimpanzee, where female goes into estrus, you get bright red genital swellings, olfactory cues, and so forth, and it's not concealed at all. Cyclic ovulation, and then men and women, of course, differ in their fertility curves over the lifespan. So this is just one example. That is, fertility declines with increasing age for both sexes, but is more steeply age graded in women compared to men. Now, to an evolutionist, it would be absolutely astonishing and it would defy logic if there existed absolutely no psychological, strategic, or behavioral sex differences that correspond to these fundamentally different adaptive problems that men and women have faced that co-evolved along with their sex-differentiated reproductive biology. Now, in the new book, I basically break down sexual conflict into 3 temporal contexts: before mating, after a mateship has formed, and during the aftermath of breakups. And I'm going to be focusing more on bad stuff that happens before mating. So I'm going to be talking about sexual harassment and some other nasty things. But in the book, for those who are interested, I talk about sexual conflict within relationships. So sexual infidelity, jealousy, resource infidelity, and I devote a whole chapter on ways that couples can cope with sexual conflicts that occur after a mateship is formed. And then, of course, after you break up, sexual conflicts don't end there. You think, boy, I finally negotiated the mating market, sexual conflict would occur there. I negotiated a relationship. I finally gotten rid of, jettisoned or ejected or dumped this bad mate. Finally, I'm done with sexual conflict. And the answer is no. There's sexual conflict that occurs in the aftermath of breakups. And I devote a chapter to the topic of stalking and revenge porn on that, but I'm not going to have a chance to get into those topics now. Just to give you a sense of what I cover in the book, and what I'm going to be covering in this talk is a very small subset of that. So one way to think about sexual conflict theory is that if it is the case that males and females differ in their optimum level of a particular trait or characteristic, then there's this zone of conflict. So in this hypothetical example, if it's more optimal for a male to seek sex sooner, before less time has elapsed, than it is optimal for a female, then there's this zone of conflict. And what we expect from sexual conflict theory is that each sex will evolve adaptations to influence the other to be closer to their optimum. And so there will be adaptations and counter adaptations that are attempting to pull the sexes in different directions. One, you can draw an analogy between you're driving a car and there's a steering wheel, and there are 2 pairs of hands on the steering wheel, one male and one female, and each is trying to pull it in the direction that's closer to its own optimum. And so there's this zone of conflict that occurs, and this is just one particular type of conflict that occur. And we know that the sexes differ in this, that men pursue sex sooner after less time has elapsed than women. So this is just graph from a study David Schmidt and I did a while back, where on the y-axis is likelihood of sex happening, x-axis is how much time is you've known the person and you find them very attractive. If you've known the person for 5 years, you find them very attractive, no sex differences. Both sexes agree, high likelihood of sex happening. But for every time interval thereafter, men indicate a higher likelihood of pursuing sex, and women kind of bottom out after about a week, a day, an evening, and an hour. Men never do get highly negative about the prospect of sex, even after 1 hour. And my colleague, former student David Schmidt, has done this cross-culturally, and these same sex differences occur in all 52 or so cultures that he's examined. Another one is amount of investment prior to sexual intercourse. Again, the same logic applies there. Different optimum for males and females. Mate value discrepancies. So in the crude American mate value rating scale, if the male is a 6 and the female is an 8, and the male wants to mate with the female 8 typically does not want to mate with the male 6, and so there's this zone of conflict. And you may think, well, maybe the male just realizes he's a 6 and the female is an 8, but that's not the case, because it turns out that males overestimate their mate value on average, although there's an important individual difference in who overestimates their mate value, which I'll mention in a little while. But on average, men are more likely to overestimate their mate value. So the man might think he's an 8 when in fact he's a 6. again, it's going to result in conflict when he feels resentment toward the woman who rejects him, even though he thinks he is within her mate value range. Okay, evolved sex differences that produce sexual conflict. One of the most important is the desire for sexual variety. This is, from a psychological perspective, this is one of the largest sex differences that's ever been documented. Very high magnitude effects, replicable across cultures. So, number of partners desired, men desire more partners, time elapsed before seeking sex, the nature of sexual fantasies, so men do more partner switching during the course of a single sexual fantasy episode, and they also have sexual fantasies about a wider variety of potential partners. Patronage of prostitutes, 99% plus are males patrons rather than female patrons. Can men and women be just friends? Well, the answer is yes, they can, but men on average tend to have more difficulty being just friends because they become sexually attracted to their female friend, and when that attraction is not reciprocated, it can result in conflict and sometimes the termination of that opposite sex friendship. This is one that is perhaps even appalling. Could you enjoy having sex with someone that you hated? Most women say absolutely not. Men are on average okay with that. This is a slide that Dave Frederick kindly loaned to me, where he had a massive sample of thousands and thousands of people, and this is desired number of sex partners, desired number of casual sex partners, and the blue bars are men, and the red bars are women. You can see you don't even have to run the statistics to see that the sexes differ pretty dramatically on this. So, in short, I'm not making this up. Men and women do differ in these respects. Another sex difference: men on average find women more attractive than women find men. So this is, and this is more for short-term mating in the casual sex arena. So these are data from OkCupid, where men rated women on how attractive they were. It's kind of hard to see, but on the right side is most attractive and left side is least attractive. And as you can see, the top men, it's a kind of a normal distribution. Men find women of all ranges of attractiveness. Whereas if you look at the blue bars on the bottom, women find men on average less attractive. And so what that means in part is that men are sexually attracted to women who are not at all sexually attracted to them. And that asymmetry is going to occur far more often than the reverse. Another finding, this is from Doug Kendrick's study. What is the minimum percentile that you would find acceptable in a partner of the different qualities like intelligence? What is the minimum percentile that partner would have to be? And the sexes are by and large similar when it comes to a marriage partner, a steady date, or even a date. But when it comes to casual sex, men drop their standards to embarrassing levels. Again, and this is a very pervasive finding. Schmidt and I found it in our studies as well, across a wide variety of characteristics. Sex differences in sexual disgust. So this is on the left, a picture of a disgust reaction, and on the right is a picture of a former student of mine, Diana Fleischman, who is not there because she's disgusting, but because she has studied sexual disgust and is one of the people, along with Josh Tiber, Lathal Shawaf, who have discovered and talked about this very large sex difference in sexual disgust. I'll come back to this issue and why this is an important adaptation, having to do with sending unwanted sexual photographs to other people. Sexual double standards. These are horrific things, and yes, they still exist. And they still exist. So in other words, the typical sexual double standard is something like that women are judged more harshly for engaging in casual sex than men are, or women are judged more harshly for sexual infidelity than men are. The fact is these sexual double standards still exist. They exist cross-culturally. and they exist even in the most sexually egalitarian cultures, such as Norway, or Sweden, or the Netherlands. And just to give you a quick example, I'm not making this stuff up. This is a recently published study that published with Pat Durkee and a number of cross-cultural collaborators, where we're looking at the status consequences of having sex. So these are just a few of our samples from Korea, Japan, Beijing. We had Transylvanian gypsies, a sample from Zimbabwe, Brazil, Colombia, and so forth. And we were interested in, well, if you engaged in this particular act, would that increase your status or decrease your status or have no impact on your status? And what we found is having a reputation as an easily accessible sex partner had a decrease the status of both men and women, but significantly more so for women in every culture. We had 14 different cultures. I'm just showing 6 here, or actually 5. Having sex with 2 people in one night, another form of casual sex. Again, huge sex difference in the status consequences, where it hurts women's status substantially more than it hurts men's status. Now, interesting finding, this is a study that I didn't do, but interesting, Gut, I don't know how to pronounce the other names, but you can see that reference there. What counts as sex for men? This is really interesting. I kissed another person deeply. Well, 12% of men say, yes, that counts as sex. My partner kissed someone deeply, 24% say that counts as sex. I fondled someone's genitals, 19%. My partner fondled someone's genitals, 46% say that counts as sex. Oral contact, 41%, but my partner does it, 65%. Now, you may think that men are horrible and that they have this horrible double standard, which of course they do. But the interesting question is, well, what about women? When we look at women, what counts as sex for women? I kissed another person deeply. My partner did, similar difference. I fondled someone's genitals. My partner does, oh, that's sex for sure. Oral contact, almost double. If my partner does it, does it count as sex? And so what we have here is another interesting double standard. So not men versus women, but rather self versus partner, a sexual double standard that hasn't been as thoroughly explored. Male sexual overperception bias. And this is, there's some current controversy about it, and it's been, there's been some interesting studies and different explanations and so forth, but it's a pretty reliable finding. That is, typical thing is a woman smiles at a man thinks, oh, she's interested in me, she wants my body, she's sexually interested, and the woman is thinking, no, I was just being friendly, I was being polite, or this guy was a creep and he was making me nervous, and so my smile was a nervous smile. Men over-infer, on average, women's sexual interest when it ain't there. Interestingly, and this is a study Karen Perilou, Jamie Confer, and I did publish in 2012, we found this is where we brought people into the laboratory, had them interact with each other in kind of a speed dating type format, and then evaluate whether they were interested in the other person or that the other person was interested in them. And we found that women underestimated, they had an underperception bias. That is, men were saying, yes, I'm really interested in that woman that I just interacted with, and women were saying, no, he's not interested in me at all. So they were actually underperceiving compared to men. But interestingly, and this is where we need to move beyond the on-average differences to look at individual differences that are predictable. Not all men are equally susceptible to the sexual overperception bias. What we found is that men who are high on narcissism, that is, men who have a grandiose sense of themselves, they feel entitled, including sexually entitled, they think they're hot, but they're not. And men who are high on the SOI, the sociosexual orientation inventory, that originally Steve Gangstead and Jeff Simpson developed a while back, basically short-term mating strategy. So men high on narcissism and men high on short-term mating strategy are more susceptible to this sexual overperception bias And we think that the reason is that it facilitates the pursuit of a short-term mating strategy. Let's see. I'm going to skip that. So basically, features of male sexual psychology that produce this unwanted persistence include the sexual overperception bias, which we found is strongest for the women who were judged to be physically attractive. There are these and other failures at cross-sex mind reading. It's a point that I'm going to come back to at the end. Misperceptions of their own mate value, low thresholds for sexual attraction, and sexual attraction to cues of sexual exploitability. And I will just mention these very briefly because I can see that I'm taking too long on all this. But these are studies that I did with Carrie Getz, or spearheaded by Carrie Getz, Judy Easton, and David Lewis, on attraction to sexual exploitability cues. And we had 100+ photographs of women who differed in these various cues. Was the woman intelligent? Was the woman drunk? Was the woman sleepy? And so forth. And had them rated on how easy they would be to sexually exploit in different ways. Persuade into having sex, seduce, pressure into having sex, and so forth. And we found a variety of these. The woman's intoxicated, sleepy, gullible, emotionally vulnerable, having low cognitive capacity, young, it's a very important one, lacking bodyguards, that these women were perceived as very sexually exploitable. But again, individual differences, and these are crucial and have been relatively ignored by people in the field, I think. That is, men pursuing a short-term mating strategy and men high on the dark triad personality traits were especially attracted to women who were high on rated sexual exploitability. So narcissism, I've already mentioned, Machiavellianism, pursuing an exploitative interpersonal strategy as a lifestyle strategy, and psychopathy, which people high on this dimension have low levels of empathy. They tend to torture animals when they're younger and so forth. These are nasty dudes. Context effect on sexual arousal. So would you encourage a woman to drink to increase the odds of having sex, keep trying to have sex even after she says no, or slip her a drug to increase the chance that she will have sex? Dan Ariely and George Lowenstein in 2006 first discovered this in a very small sample of men where they had a sexual arousal condition and then a control condition, and found that men who were sexually aroused were more willing to engage in these forms of action. We've recently replicated this. This is a study spearheaded by Courtney Crosby in my lab that literally just says under review, but it literally just got accepted for publication today, involving a much larger sample and including men and women. So there are all kinds of context effects. I think I'll mention, let's see, how am I doing on time here? Okay, I think I'm not going to be able to present as much stuff as I hope. So let me maybe talk about sexual harassment and then draw a few conclusions. I'm going to have to skip some important stuff. I thought I would talk faster and get more material in, so my apologies for that. One of the things we were interested in, again, this deals with a sex difference in perceptions. So how harassing is this act? He stared at her chest while talking to her. He asked her if she would take off her clothes, leered at her when she walked by, told her about his sexual expertise, and told her that if she would sleep with him, he would buy her an expensive gift. How harassing is this act? Well, what we found in our lab, and this is with Anna Sedlicek, one of my current graduate students, that women both perceive those acts as more harassing than men do, and women are more upset if someone in their workplace does that to them than men are. Okay, and these are very reliable sex differences in perceptions of sexual harassment. Very strong implications for how sexual harassment policies are written. So as one example of this is very interesting. A national supermarket chain instituted this policy of what they call superior customer service. They instructed their clerks to smile and make eye contact with customers, And what they found is that the women who were instructed to do this ended up filing a sexual harassment lawsuit, or multiple, because the guys who they smiled at, made eye contact with, were asking them out for dates, sexual propositions, some cases stalking. They were misreading the superior customer service as a sexual interest, when in fact it wasn't there. So eventually, as a result of these lawsuits, they eliminated that policy. Had this supermarket chain been aware of the male sexual overperception bias, that men tend to overinfer sexual interest when it's not there based on minimal ambiguous cues, they wouldn't have instituted the superior customer service policy to begin with. Sexual entitlement. Men who are high in status feel sexually entitled. And they also overestimate their attractiveness to women, and they have lower empathy. This is one of the startling things. Decker Keltner out of Berkeley discovered this in conjunction with other co-authors, that people with higher wealth have lower levels of empathy. And John Barge, a famous social psychologist, discovered this unconscious link between power and sex, but especially with that subset of men who show high likelihood to sexually harass. So which men are sexual harassers? Sexual harassers in the workplace tend to be serial sexual harassers. And that's why often when you will see multiple women file a sexual harassment claim against the same person, most guys don't sexually harass. It is a subset of serial sexual harassers that do. And those that do tend to be high in the SOI. That is, they tend to be pursuing a short-term mating strategy, and they tend to be high on the dark triad, low on empathy, high on sense of entitlement, and interpersonally exploitative. Okay, we found similar sex differences with acts of sexual aggression. So how upset would a woman be versus a man be if someone touched their body without their permission, physically restrained them, tried to force sex acts on them, and so forth? And what we found is, so this is how upset we have men raters and women raters, men raters in, I guess that's gold, and women raters in red, how upsetting from 0 to 7, extremely upsetting. And what we found is that this looks like a small difference, but it is a reliable difference. Men underestimate how upsetting these acts of sexual aggression are to women. Interestingly, women overestimate how upsetting these acts of sexual aggression are to men. So there are errors in cross-sex mind reading in both directions. Of course, the first one is much more problematic than the second one. So, okay, I think that I need to, unfortunately, skip a lot of interesting stuff that I was going to talk about having to do with sexual assault. So I apologize for that, and happy to chat about any of that. So I want to give some big picture issues. Okay, one is that I think that there are very important mismatches between ancestral and modern environments that in some cases exacerbate conflict between the sexes. Okay, one is the workplace. So historically, humans evolved as hunters and gatherers, and there was division of labor. Men primarily did the large game hunting. There's a little bit of controversy about that, but I think no controversy about men were largely doing the large game, high risk hunting, women more the gathering. In the modern workplace, it's a sexually integrated workplace in many professions. When men and women are working together and mating mechanisms are getting activated in contexts where they should not get activated. Second, modern environments, people move around a lot, and especially when women go to college or go across country for a job, they don't have the close kin, their genetic relatives that formerly served as bodyguards. And having a large number of close kin in proximity is a predictor of women not getting abused or assaulted in various ways. A.J. Figueredo, the evolutionary psychologist, has documented this Spain and I believe Mexico as well. A third mismatch, relative anonymity. We evolved in small groups where everyone pretty much knew everyone else within the group. Now we live in large urban areas. There's high levels of geographic mobility, higher levels of anonymity. And in fact, perhaps the internet creates a level of anonymity that also didn't formerly exist. Cyber technology is another one. So internet dating is something that was unknown 20 years ago. Now we have the cyber technology to do mate monitoring in various ways. So in some countries, there are mating apps where there are some countries where it's illegal for the woman to leave the country without permission of her husband or father, and they download these apps on her cell phone that alert the husband or father if the woman tries to leave the country without her permission across the border. But there are, even in the United States and Western cultures, there are cyber technologies that allow mate monitoring in abhorrent ways that weren't available prior to that. Cyber stalking and of course revenge porn. And then of course novel drugs, rohypnol, date rape drug, tranquilizers, alcohol in high concentrations. Alcohol's been around humans for many, many thousands of years, but only in the last 6,000 or 7,000 in the levels of concentration that it is now available to them. And we know that alcohol has very predictable effects, and one of which is disarming the evolved defenses of those who might be victims of sexual assault. Okay, so some tentative suggestions for reducing sexual conflict. Okay, one is mind the gap. So you go to the UK and you go to what they call tube stations, we call them subway stations, and there are these signs that say mind the gap, and it basically is watch out for that distance between the platform and the subway car. And I think that we have to mind the sex gap, that is knowledge about sex differences in our sexual psychology. Again, well, I mentioned that I think sex difference denialism, while often well-intentioned, harms women if we fail to realize that the sex differences are some of the root causes of the conflicts that we see. And so pretending that they don't exist, I think, hurts women, does not help them. We need to understand that male and female minds differ, and that they differ in their sexual inferences, men's inferences about women's sexuality, their sexual psychology, and women's inferences about men's sexual emotions. I mentioned that sexual disgust earlier, and this shows up because this is another form of sexual assault in a way, is sending unwanted photographs of genitals to women. And men are often sexually aroused and find attractive body parts of women, naked body parts of women, and seem to be oblivious to the fact that most women, there are studies of this, find the images of male genitals to be gross, and that's the word that they use, gross. They're sexually disgusted by these things on average, not sexually attracted. And so there's failures of mind reading on that score. Second, sexual harassment codes and stalking laws are written according to what's called the reasonable person standard. And that is, would a reasonable person view this pattern of behavior as sexually harassing? Or would a reasonable person, in the case of stalking laws, view this pattern of behavior as inducing fear in the victim? And because there are sex differences in both of these, what we have is the laws that are written according to a reasonable person standard actually hurt women, because there is no generic reasonable person. If a reasonable woman on average differs from a reasonable man, then let's say the judge is a reasonable man or a reasonable woman. Okay, the verdict is going to be different. Or the jury is made up of some unknown combination or a known combination of reasonable men and reasonable women, who perceive things very differently because males are stuck in their own sexual psychology and women in theirs. But in this case, the laws, while written in a gender-neutral way, and you could think that's good, we want gender-neutral laws, but in this case, it harms women if the reasonable people doing the adjudicating happen to be, quote, reasonable men as opposed to reasonable women. We need to recognize that there are profound individual differences, and sexual conflict, the fact that there are average differences in our sexual psychology and differences that have resulted in differing optima for males and females, resulting in these zones of conflict, that there are overlapping distributions. It's not all men and not all women, and there are predictable individual differences in susceptibility to these various features. We need to recognize that there are mismatches between ancestral and modern environments, and we also need to understand that men and women must, I think, cooperate and join forces to reduce sexual violence. That is, we are intrinsically a cooperative species with members of our own sex and members of the other sex, and that a cooperative venture, so as an example, we need to recognize that there are, like the Brock Turner, the Stanford student who was caught sexually assaulting a woman behind a dumpster. It was two students who I believe were either from Sweden or the Netherlands, I can't remember which, actually intervened, stopped the sexual assault, and tackled Brock Turner, which eventually resulted in him being brought to justice to some degree. He got a very lenient sentence, in my opinion. But the fact is that men need to join forces with women in reducing sexual violence, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and all the other forms of sexual violence. Now, the final point I want to make is that education about evolved sex differences is critical, and that you can't use introspection about your own sexual psychology to infer the sexual psychology of the other sex. As I hope I've shown, there are predictable sex differences, and if you introspect about your own sexual psychology and think, women, oh, they're going to be attracted to photographs of my genitals, or I'm attracted to this woman, therefore she must be attracted to me. These are errors, and knowledge and education about these predictable errors in sexual mind reading, I think, are critical to reducing conflict between the sexes. In conclusion, sexual violence against women, I think, is the most widespread human rights problem in the world. I actually think it should become part of the international human rights codes, in addition to those that currently exist, and that an evolutionary perspective can help us, at least in part, not alone, but at least in part, to reduce conflict between the sexes. And for those of you who are interested, obviously I go into these topics and a bunch more in greater detail in my book, which will be out next month for those who are interested. And I thank you very much for your attention, and would welcome questions or dialogue.
David, thank you so much. I only wish that we could have part two and hear the slides that you had to gloss over, but I think a lot of people are interested in this topic, obviously, and I think that your book has extraordinary potential. So
thank you
so much.
Well, I hope so. I hope it does some. I hope it does some good.
It definitely seems like there's a lot of potential. Absolutely. We have time for, maybe we can go until 8 our times. We've got about 10-15 minutes for questions. If people want to virtually raise their hands, I see a hand from William Costello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. Thanks for the talk, Dr. Buss. And more importantly, thank you for your contribution to intellectual life. Maybe 5 years ago, I read Evolution of Desire, and it completely course corrected my own career path. and 5 years later, I'm studying under your own former student, Dr. David Schmidt. So that brings me to my question. I've got a poster presentation assignment coming up, and we've been asked to present on a somewhat controversial idea of our own choosing. I was inspired by your writing on the supply and demand problem of eligible men to women. So my presentation will be on mating mismatch, and more specifically around a return to polygyny, how our modern dating norms are artificially skewing sex ratios and triggering short-term mating strategies in men and women. I'm just wondering if you can expand on what you see as the solution to this supply and demand problem of eligible men to women, and particularly as polygyny seems to be a very destabilizing type of society to live in. I'm keen to hear what solutions you have on that problem.
Yeah, really interesting, interesting question. Sex ratio imbalances profoundly important and understudied topic. Of course, sex ratio, just more generally, sex ratio imbalances, we know they occur in a variety of contexts. So, for example, in China, the one-child policy resulted in a surplus of men because there was selective abortion and infanticide of females for a period of time. Now they've eliminated that one-child policy, but there's this whole generation of where there's a surplus of men, and in some contexts, well, of course, polygyny is going to generate a surplus of men on the mating market. So if you start out with an equal sex ratio and you have one man who's married to, so let's say 4 women, then you're going to have 3 men who are bachelors. And then I think, as you implied, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, what you found in your poster. If you have effective polygyny, that is, if you have men who are either engaged in, let's say, serial mating more than women, as sometimes happens, or engaged in a series of short-term matings and, in essence, taking them out of the mating market for long-term mating, then you could have a sex ratio imbalance in the long-term mating market. So all these things are problematic. So there's some evidence, although there's some controversy about it, but there's some evidence that when you have a surplus of men in the mating market, then there's a higher rate of rape in those contexts. So that's definitely problematic. As to solutions to it, I don't know. I mean, we've in most Western cultures we have legalized monogamy and forbidden legal bigamy and polygamy, but of course people engage in effective polygamy or effective polygyny as well. What is the solution to that? Boy, I have no idea. What are your solutions?
Sorry, I muted myself.
Okay.
Yeah, well, the poster doesn't really get a chance to go into solutions, but it kind of frames the aspects of modern culture that are kind of exasperating the problem, such as online dating, such as perhaps women's hypergamy being in tension with their own success in the workplace. I think perhaps the democratization of sex work, pornography seems to pacify these otherwise destabling portions of society who otherwise would be causing a lot of trouble. I think Wilson and Daly's papers kind of show that that generally happens. However, now they seem to be living in online worlds instead of out causing trouble.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the fascinating findings that the younger generations are having considerably less sex than previous generations. And I'm not quite sure why. I wonder if part of it has to do with that, with online pornography.
Yeah, perhaps. Well, thank you for your time, and I'll send you the poster if you're interested to see it.
I'm very much interested. I would appreciate that.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to reading and reviewing the book. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Thank you.
Next, it looks like we have a question from our Evolutionary Studies student, Roberto.
Hi, yeah. So I'm curious as to what your opinion is on how technology, and I guess a better way to put it is scientific discovery, is rapidly affecting these evolutionary strategies. So I guess I'll frame it in this way. So, there had to have been a time in our species where we discovered, that there is that paternity is a thing. So, that probably radically and drastically changed the path that our species took, because now we understood at some point in our history that this isn't just a random thing. So men impregnate a woman, and so now there's a vested interest in establishing and knowing paternity. And as technology has increased, we've developed things to further, confirm this. So we have paternity tests. In the future, we have even disruptive technologies that are going to come out, meaning we have currently things like neonatology technologies that allow women to, give birth to children to infants that would have otherwise died. So we've now extended the ability for a woman to, give birth to healthy babies. At some point in the future, I would assume we are going to make it possible for men to reproduce artificially without the need of impregnating a woman, right? Ectogenesis, or whatever you want to call it. And so, how do you think that that's going to affect the development of our species as human beings? Like going into the distant future, how do you think that will change how we mate?
Yeah, well, that's a fascinating question, of course, but I would say that anyone who attempts to predict the future is almost surely doomed to fail. I mean, the only safe prediction you could make is that since more than 99% of all species that have ever existed are now extinct, then maybe that's a safer prediction. But I don't think anybody could have predicted many of the things that are going on right now. So, I mean, you go back 30 years, people were worried about population explosion. Now people are worried about population replacement, because in many Western cultures, we have below replacement levels of reproduction. I don't think anyone could have predicted that something like internet, perhaps they would have predicted pornography, but cyber stalking, revenge porn, there's so many things that I think we couldn't have predicted. So I would be foolish if I hazard a prediction about how things are going to be much in the future. Maybe 6 months out or 12 months out, it looks like there's the end of the pandemic. Here's another one. People predicted that in the pandemic we would have a baby boom because people would be at home having sex all the time, not realizing that part of sexual attraction is novelty, and being with the same person day in and day out doesn't necessarily enhance sexual attraction. So there hasn't been this baby boom that everybody predicted. In fact, the opposite. There's been a decrease in reproduction during the pandemic. So, anyway, do you have predictions?
No. I mean, no. No. I don't like you. I think it's very difficult to predict, but fascinating to speculate on. So I just wanted to see if you had any opinions.
Yeah.
So with that, I just want to be mindful of people's time. So we're hitting 8 o'clock here, and we really appreciate this, Dr. Boss. I'll say that there's a couple things in the chat I just want to put out there quickly. Andreas Moreno is asking if there's a plan to translate the book to Spanish.
No, not so far, but I'm sure that there will be. So we have it's currently being translated into several languages. Korean, Polish, and I can't remember the others, but I'm sure it will be translated into Spanish. Several of my other books have been.
That's outstanding. We even have, looks like Brandon in the chat has offered to translate it into Spanish in case we need someone to do that. So that I think there's a lot of excitement. I just want you to know there are people I've counted from 4 continents in this event right here, David.
It's terrific.
So I will say that this talk has been recorded. We will post it at the SUNY New Paltz Evolutionary Studies webpage in the next couple of days. So you can look that up. And the book is called When Men Behave Badly. And I think it has some great implications for how we can nudge the dial to make society better in a lot of ways. So thank you again, Dr. Buss.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. It's been great talking to you.
And next time you're in town, I'm going to owe you that soda.
All right. Sounds good.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Okay. Take care.